Hello, my name is Winston Choi, and I am Associate Professor of Piano and Head of Piano at Roosevelt University. The title of my presentation is Getting Out of Our Own Way, Catching a Musical Ride on Our Subconscious Train. So I would like to talk a little bit about the premise of this presentation, the genesis of it, how it came about. It all started through my own practicing. As I have been experimenting in recent years with different kinds of methodologies and philosophies, I have found that when I had the most success individually, it would come as the result of me having a long period of time where I was working very deliberately, thoughtfully, and almost obsessively. And it was only when I let go of things, when I took a break, when I cleared my mind, when I perhaps was taking a walk or working on something else, that when I would come back to the piano, I found very much a lot of these ideas had crystallized, had become absorbed, and in a sense my subconscious took over, and I was no longer consciously directing myself as to what to do. Essentially, the music played itself. I've had these experiences on a micro level, working at one particular passage or one very specific kind of technical challenge. Or it was on a more macro level, an entire performance where I felt, in a sense, that there was an out-of-body experience and my hands would take over. I've only had these kinds of experiences a handful of times, but it's enough that makes me want to feel like there is something about those moments that have stayed with me and they were desirable. And because not only did I feel this complete sense of ease on stage, but I also felt completely connected to some surroundings. One such incidence was when I was playing a concerto. This was the Prokofiev's second concerto, which I had played several times at that point and had worked on for hours and hours and hours at a time. So I had this very focused, concentrated period of time working it up to a certain level, and I also had stage experience with the piece. But for me, the most memorable aspect of a particular performance I had was one where I really felt like there was an absence of physical self. I was able to somehow transcend my physical body and not be aware of much of anything. I was observing myself play, but I didn't feel a sense of weight. There was a weightlessness to my playing. I couldn't even really feel my own body. It was just this moment where I felt like I was able to transcend my physical boundaries, my sense of limitation, and I was able to just engage with the sounds that were going around this hall. And I felt like I could zoom around the stage and have a duet with the flautist. I could listen to the percussionist and feel I was connected to them. I was able to more intrinsically connect to the conductor. So it was this ability to multitask, at the same time feel at peace with oneself, yet also feel alive with intensity. That moment, it was so fleeting, but I've been struggling to try to recreate that. And I think there are times when I am able to, and other times I'm too consciously trying to look for something, and those moments escape me. But this has also been a topic that is central to my work with my students, as well as, of course, my own practicing. It's about how do we get out of our own way and have these moments of where we are in a so-called flow state, right? Where we can simply be either so caught up in a performance that we lose our sense of self and we give ourselves over completely to the music, to our musical ideas, to the storyline, the narrative that we've worked hard to build up. Or it could be just within our work. Everything is clicking and flowing and there are positive results and we get that positive feedback and it triggers more inspired work, and before we know it, we have many breakthroughs right in front of us. So that kind of positivity within our practicing, that's something that I have thought about a great deal. And so this presentation, what I want to do is talk about some of the roadblocks, the obstacles that we musicians have grown up with, and break it down a little bit, both psychologically as well as physically, and then talk about different ways of practicing, ways that we can put into practice some of these ideas in a very practical sense. So first of all, I like to talk about 4 different kinds of feedback that we get as pianists. This is from an early age all the way up to whatever age you're at. We constantly get this kind of feedback, and we have to learn how to process it because it has a direct effect on our performances and our ability to make music. So the first I will say is positive external feedback. That's the thunderous applause of an audience. And this often comes through gestures, people showing outwardly their appreciation for what it is that you do, or it could come in the form of verbal comments. Is it always sincere? Not necessarily, even though very often it comes from a good place. It's people showing you their support, cheering you on, being your cheerleader. It could be friends, it could be colleagues. But we very often need this. There's no escaping that fact. We need somebody or people to validate our hard work, our ideas. And without that validation, sometimes it's hard to find that spark. So the problem with outside validation, as I said, besides it being not always the most sincere, is that because when we have the absence of it, this positive feedback externally, it can then be very hurtful because we're looking for something, we're looking for somebody's approval, and if they don't quite grant it exactly the way we want, we feel hurt, or we feel we're somehow lacking, or we didn't do enough. Of course, when it comes to entering competitions, being in that kind of place, if all you're looking for is that outside validation, it's hit or miss, right? Because we can never predict, no matter how thorough our presentation. So the first topic was, as I just said, positive external feedback. Then we have negative external feedback. This is one where a judge, a coach, a teacher, or a colleague, or maybe sometimes even a stranger in the form of an internet troll criticizes you. Okay? So when we hear these harsh words, very often they sit with us much more even than the positive external feedback. We internalize this, and it's unfortunate because it can have real destructive power. These words can come back in when we least want to, these nagging voices that tell us we're not good enough, that we're a disappointment. And a lot of times, these negative external voices, they're just little fleeting moments. When it comes from a teacher, it might not have been intended to cause damage. It's just somebody truly voicing their disapproval. But those voices can come back and cause us to doubt ourselves right when we're about to jump into a really tricky passage. Or let's say we have a memory slip on stage. If there has been this voice of disapproval, a teacher or somebody expressing their deep disappointment in you, those voices can hit us on stage and cause us to be paralyzed because we're trying to avoid that. However, with that being said, the most perhaps powerful voice is this negative external voice, because it causes us to sometimes take a deeper look from within and cause us to have real change. Because as we all know, change from within is so difficult. When we hear it expressed from somebody else, if it hurts a little bit, forces us to reckon with ourselves, maybe validates something that we feel we should have been doing but we are not doing, that sometimes is the impetus it takes for us to provoke real change from within. So absolutely necessary, but we have to learn how to cultivate that. And so let's talk about positive internal feedback, which is one where we tell ourselves, good job. We pat ourselves on the back. You know, we cheer ourselves on. We tell ourselves not to get too caught up with all the little voices here and there. We must soldier on. We must continue. We must think positively, think about our ideas, move forward, okay? Pep talking. It's so important, and I think that's what we need to do on stage. That's what we need to do right before we walk on stage. But we need to also do that in the practice room. So, of course, if we're exclusively just telling ourselves, you're doing great, wonderful work, of course, there are no standards. We don't push ourselves. We don't challenge ourselves. We don't force ourselves to grow, right? We cannot only be letting everything go. Of course, we must work intensely, which means there's a lot of judgment, and there must be a lot of evaluation and analysis. But I think if we've never really practiced letting things go and saying, let's keep going, let's keep moving forward, enjoy music, enjoy the process, enjoy this experience. If we haven't practiced that, there's no way to turn that on suddenly under pressure, right? It's really hard. We must have enough of an experience. We have to draw upon our past in any situation when we're on stage, when we are feeling uncomfortable, when we are feeling self-conscious. And the last of the 4 categories is the negative internal feedback. Again, we must give ourselves that at times, because that's what causes us to change. If we internalize something that we don't like about ourselves, about our playing, and we really take it to heart, it makes us have this reckoning. We are honest with ourselves. But there comes a time when we have to learn to accept that voice, hear it for what it is, but put it off to the side and move forward. There's a time and place for that negative voice. And it's not going to be on stage. It's not going to always be in the practice room. So let's talk about how some of these different kinds of feedback affects us as pianists. All right, so let's say, for instance, at the piano, I'm playing a certain run, okay? There's a passage, and let's say it's an arpeggio and then a chord. So let's say within the context of practicing that, we slip and there are wrong notes, okay? Immediately what rushes to our mind is we wince and we think, let's cancel that and replace it with 10 good ones, hopefully, okay? So if it's a passage that feels relatively comfortable, we might be able to do so. But what's going on inside our minds? I think we are so fearful of missing a thumb. We are so fearful of it being bumpy and maybe missing the chord that we're reaching to that we start to play in a more guarded, self-conscious way, right? So by doing so, we are playing to avoid mistakes. If we've given that voice, that negative internal voice, so much power and strength that our performances are loaded with this voice inside of our heads telling us not to do this, not to do that. That voice of judgment, this is no good. That can be crippling. It can cause us to, of course, not play our best, but it can also cause us to be very careful and self-conscious. So I think it's a fine line between being self-aware versus being overly cautious. We want to be aware of our surroundings, aware of our bodies, aware of how we feel. But the more aware we are, it starts to dip into that territory of us being self-conscious, and we feel like I'm struggling with this. I worry about my memory. I worry about my preparation. I worry about so-and-so in the audience. I worry about what happened when I played this piece a few weeks ago and it didn't go that well. All those voices. And so instead of immediately trying to cancel something, let's say we play this, I'll take the example of a more awkward passage. Let's say it's a half diminished arpeggio and we struggle. We have wrong notes. We don't get comfortable with it. So what we might do is relate that slightly awkward arpeggio with one that is easier. Or C major. So what was a little bit awkward, the fingers are a little bit more spread out, more risk involved. If we take what I would call comparison practicing, we take an example of music that is difficult to play or a little bit awkward. And then we take an example of music that is easier and stack them side by side, juxtapose them next to one another. Some of our experience with this easier arpeggio will enter the picture and get assimilated and absorbed into the more difficult arpeggio. I notice this all the time. Let's say we play a passage in the left hand. Okay? Narrow steps, wide intervals. It's uncomfortable for the hand. Right? Let's compare that to C major. And then. After a while, you start to realize they're not so different from one another. Right? This more awkward run that I just played has more wide intervals, but after a while you learn to move the hand in a similar manner. Any key. Let's say we're practicing scales. Let's say B flat minor. Those awkward intervals, those spaces. See what I'm doing? You go back and forth between what is easier, what's more intuitive, what is more difficult, and you go back and forth until they feel roughly the same. I think this is an excellent way of practicing left-hand passages. I've given a talk before on symmetrical inversion, which is where we use our dominant hand to teach our weaker secondary hand. But that's the same idea of comparison practicing, right? So you take an idea, you take a passage in the left hand, and you flip it around and you play the symmetrical inversion. Right? So a passage like that, for instance, your right hand teaches your left hand what to do. And how does it do so? Your right hand has spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours working in such a way where it's very intuitive to get around the instrument. What we can do with our left hand, instead of consciously trying to practice in a vacuum, we tap into our subconscious and tell it, hey, can you absorb some of these trade secrets, what the right hand has worked at for all of these years? Can you somehow absorb it and just send it over to the left arm? Because it's our own body, yes, we can do that. We don't have to explain it. We don't necessarily have to work it out. It can happen if we unlock this within ourselves, if we get out of our own way. A certain mindlessness may achieve that, okay? Just to kind of feel like our bodies are symmetrical. Back to a certain idea that I had mentioned earlier on about the intuition versus our instincts. Okay, instincts is very much fight or flight. Very primal. It's something that we perhaps don't really have conscious control over. And it comes a lot through genetics, through our life experiences. So if we fear a memory slip, if we fear getting in front of people, when we get to that state, fight or flight, we guard ourselves or we run, right? And because we're on stage, we have nowhere to run. Typically, what happens is our fingers will run faster. Our heart beats faster. We are more guarded. Everything is more locked and closed. All movement becomes more restricted from the neck, shoulders, the way we breathe, even, of course, the wrists, arms, and the shape of our fingers might become a little bit more curved and tight when we're guarded. So that's instinct. So what's the difference between instinct and intuition? Our intuition is through learned experiences, absorbing many different experiences, consciously, subconsciously. It's in a sense, taking our past right? And our subconscious makes a decision right there in the moment, that gut feeling you have. It makes a decision right there to do this or to do that. And that's an example of our intuition taking over. And what is intuitive at the piano, right? If the hands simply kind of know where to go, we can trust this intuitiveness. And I think our intuition sometimes gives us a pathway into finding an ideal fingering. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the idea of our intuition being developed over a period of time, I'll give you an example. Let's say if we were to be working on a Mozart piano sonata, and beforehand we decided to take a deep dive. We were to spend time in opera houses, to watch, of course, Mozart operas, Mozart symphonies. Not only listen to string quartets play, but watch them rehearse. Watch master classes with singers, with pianists. Hear dozens, if not hundreds, of different recordings and do some kind of comparative analysis. Read biographies. If we had done all of that prior to working on this particular sonata we're about to learn, we would have a certain kind of intuition about what we like or what we don't like. When it comes to questions of taste, of course, if we've read books and we've heard lectures, and it's all of this information that's within us, our subconscious will go in there and sort through all of that and choose what it likes the most, what has resonated with us most deeply, and help us make these decisions on the fly, in the moment, when it comes to pedaling, how much rubato, how much timing, sound production, being in search for character. All of that can happen more or less intuitively because of those experiences we've had. So that's why it's important, all the things that we do within our lives to supplement our piano practicing will come back to help us, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. So back to the idea of a fingering. If I'm playing, let's say, I don't know which finger I'm going to use. Okay? We tried all these different fingerings. Our hands, I think, can be trusted to find for itself what feels best for it. Not to try to outsmart our hands, not to let the mind think this has got to be the fingering, or that's what some editor wrote. It's their hands and it feels intuitive to them, but that might not be the case for us. So how do we make a fingering choice? Maybe we try 3, 4, 5 different fingerings, try it slowly, try it in tempo, and eventually, our hands can be trusted to make those decisions for us. I think if you practice 3 or 4 different fingerings over and over and over, at some point just think about the music, let the ideas, let our concept of the sound be at the forefront of our minds, lift our hands, and then see what comes out. Then observe. That's the fingering my hand chose. Try it again. Can you consciously pay attention to it? Can you think of other things while the hand still goes there? If so, that's the fingering. That's when we can get out of our own way and trust our hands to find the ideal fingering. Right? This is not to be confused with a bad fingering choice that we've made and it's been absorbed through muscle memory. Right? I'm talking about early on in the process when you're trying to find the ideal fingerings. Fixing a fingering that is just a poor choice, right? If it comes from the teacher and the teacher has given you a better fingering, how to allow it to feel more intuitive and natural. I think what we sometimes need to do is, as I said, not to try to cancel out the old fingering immediately, but play the fingering that's so-called a bad fingering and play the better fingering and notice the difference. Maybe one fingering is a little bit weak. It doesn't give you enough brightness of the sound, or there's too many thumbs, or you're relying too much on the 4th finger. And then by going back and forth contrasting this and that, we start to feel like we have a choice. And you then become more psychologically kind of attuned to fingering choices. So it's the same thing when a student plays a wrong note and it doesn't bother them. They won't make that change, even if you've circled it over and over and over. You don't want them to make that change just because you've circled it. You want them to make that change because they hear it as the incorrect harmony and there's a reason that it's being circled. So we should go back and forth, play that wrong note, play the correct note, and try to hear the difference. Absorb it. Feel it deeply from within. And then it becomes a choice, and then there are more connections, both psychologically and physically, to the right note or the wrong note. And after a while, change can happen from within. So let's continue talking about some ideas about how to put some of these ideas into practice. I think a lot of times when we sit down at the piano, as I said, as we struggle with something, we very often will put things into a loop, okay? Mindless drilling. It might be in the form of, I can't play these notes, I'm going to keep playing it until somehow I have a breakthrough and it works for me. Okay? So that's been generally regarded as a bad way of practicing, of course, because the muscle memory starts to absorb all of these so-called bad runs, and it's hard to do something else, right, after that. But it's also that voice of judgment. That's what I want to get at next. These little voices that tell us, no, that was no good. Don't step on that. Ouch, that was an accent. That was no good, right? That causes us to freeze up, gives us these little hesitancies, little doubts, right before we have a jump of some sort. And that can be destructive. Not necessarily psychologically damaging, but it's enough to make us have a little doubt in the heat of the moment. That can cause us to be a little bit flustered, can be judgmental of ourselves, right, when we miss something, or sometimes patting ourselves on the back too much just because we played something right, because we avoided stepping on that mine, right? We avoided falling down from this tightrope. So we get overly confident with it and we lose sight of a larger narrative. We lose sight of what is perhaps most important within the music. So I'll go back to this idea of comparison practicing. Many students, they work on Chopin's Etude, Opus 25, number 1. It's a wonderful etude because it encourages us to be able to have much more flexible fingers, flexible wrists. And essentially there are places where we're covering much wider intervals than what we would have typically covered in much other repertoire. So by spending time with that etude, what one absorbs within one's body is an understanding of how to get around the instrument in a fluid way, how to cover large distances, how to create light textures. Sometimes, a so-called weaker hand, let's say the left hand, or it could be the right hand, by working in isolation, it might not be able to solve a problem, but if you actually work the hands together, there's a sense of whole body involvement, and the hands are just fluid and rolling through these harmonies and chords. So I was once working with a student who was struggling with the Chopin's B flat minor scherzo. We have this melody. That's a little bit of a notoriously difficult left hand because there are these wide stretches. It's not all wide. Some wide, some small intervals. How to cover these distances. Rather than working at that particular passage in a vacuum and just practicing the left hand as some kind of new problem, what if we tap into our work from Opus 25, number 1, if we played that? When we're playing a piece like Ravel's Jadot, so this these kinds of figurations, they're all related. And instead of treating each piece, each problem as something separate, as only a new experience that must be grappled with, if we can sometimes, again, take different kinds of music. Let's say at the forefront is music that you've performed and worked on for hours. And we take other pieces that are within its orbit, similar kinds of fluid writing, similar types of patterns, and we practice them back and forth, back to back to back to back. We'll make certain kind of generalizations, and most importantly, our subconscious will help us figure out how to best play something, right? So this can work in the form of truly anything, any kind of technical problem. You've probably played something, and we spent significant hours on something in the past that might resemble that. Whether you can consciously connect or not, it doesn't matter. Just go back and forth. Practice what is comfortable. Something old, something that's within your blood, and then you practice what is new, and you try to absorb a little bit of your life experience, tap into your past consciously. By doing so, we have so many more resources at our disposal. I think our subconscious is capable of taking in everything that we've truly experienced within our lives. Right? All of our experiences, both positive and negative, but taking it all in and sorting through it and giving us the best solution right there in that moment. How to move, how to get the ideal sound, how to muscle our way through a really difficult passage. I think that element of trust is crucial. So I want to speak a little bit about trust. If I have a child who I've spent years working with them to raise them to be responsible, to have a good sense of morals, to know how to be aware of one's surroundings, we can then trust that child if they've proven it over and over and over. And when they go out into the backyard, perhaps we don't have to stare at them. We can let them be. Right? So developing that trust means you let it go. That is true freedom, I think, at the piano, if we can let go. If we are trusting our hands, if we trust our intuition to take over. To develop that trust, I think, it's very much connected to our practicing, because if we're practicing over and over and over, and again, we'll have that voice of judgment tell us repeatedly that something is not good, it's not good. Okay, that was good, this is not good, that's good. And we start to kind of attach very negative kinds of frustration, and they could just be in the form of like this little pinprick, something within us which stops us and say, do that again, that was no good. You know, that's destructive, right? Because when we're getting ready for a performance, how many times do we start the opening over and over and over until we get it just right? You know, that kind of control, hyper-control, is essential when we're practicing, but it comes to a point where we have to let go, give up that sense of control, and just walk on stage and play. Start a piece of music. If it's not ideal, we continue moving forward with it. Okay? We work very specifically on changes, how we can make it better. But again, we must let go and let the piece unfold on its own. So to develop trust, an exercise that I give to my students, how to develop that sense of trust, is to develop more comfort moving around the instrument. Right? I think a good 75% of our problems at the piano, when one is too self-conscious and guarded and moving in an overly cautious way, comes because of stretches, wrong notes with jumps, all of that sort of thing. So if I take, for example, Opus 25, number 5, that Etude by Chopin. So this is a particular etude where very often the hands have to cover intervals that would not feel too comfortable to play, largish tenths, sometimes very large intervals between two particular fingers, a lot of darting. If one becomes overly cautious when playing that, we curl things up more, and it just becomes, all those intervals will feel a little bit too big, too jagged. It's much harder to play. But even something like this could be related to so we learn how to be fluid with that left hand. If I go back to the idea about the visual, our gaze. When we are staring at something, when we become very focused, what tends to happen? It's like everything else we do in real life. We focus on one thing, everything else around it becomes fuzzy. If I focus just on my fingers, because I'm trying to control them, because I don't trust them, I have to watch exactly where they go. What's going to be fuzzy? My listening. I'm not listening as much. I might not be aware of all the tension within my body. I might not be breathing normally. My phrasing might be from note to note to note. To be able to defocus a little bit from this and absorb a little bit of everything, or to be able to selectively focus on what I'd like to focus on at any given point, it means a kind of relaxing of this and a trusting of the hands. So to develop trust of the hands is crucial. So I'll take our audience here through a series of exercises that I often have my students do, which is to play chords, let's say 4-note chords with both hands. Okay, C major, we'll start with. Play that, and then you jump an octave higher. Can we trust our hands to find the chord without looking? Which is different from, okay, so a little faster. And then to move through different keys chromatically. C major, C sharp, D, E flat, E major, maybe minor keys. So the idea with this exercise is that if I have a very clear vision in my mind of where I want to go, the hands can be trusted to find those notes. Okay? If I don't trust my hands, I have to play C minor again. I already feel paralyzed. I don't know how to find that next C minor chord. I can't. But if I play in such a way, I trust my hands, I'll get it, I'll find it. I know it. I know how to find it. I know where those notes are. Our subconscious is able to remember that feeling of C minor within our hands, right? The space between the fingers, the sound of C minor. And then when we want to play that next C minor chord, the hands will find it. So what did I do? If I was to break down what my hands are doing, I think there is a feeling that as I move my hands, they're basically soft. Right? Every joint is soft. If I'm trusting, I won't move with tension. I'll just move. Right? My hands go to where they need to go. In slow motion, there might be a sense of feeling out the piano to relate white and black keys to one another, so I can find it based upon my sense of touch. But this is not happening consciously. Right? It can't. It's too fast. But there is, in that last moment, a sense of trusting our subconscious to take all that it knows about our hands, about our bodies, about the piano, the distance between notes, sound production, and we can trust that the fingers will find those notes. All right, so I think it's so important when we're playing jumps to be able to feel that sense of ease. Okay, so one particular place in that same Chopin Etude that I was playing, Opus 25, number 5, there are these jumps. Okay, big distances, different intervals, you know, like the left hand jumps a certain distance, the right hand jumps further. You know, quite hard to practice and quite hard to measure. And I used to practice this very much, rehearsing very precise movements and staring at my fingers, make sure I don't miss. And I found that to be somewhat of a suffocating experience because it's like I was saying, I was constantly judging myself. And even when I got it right, it didn't feel good enough, and I wanted to do it again and again and again to prove to myself that it was going to be fine, but there was no deep down belief, right? So it's still guarded, and when I did miss, it was like this voice within me and said, see, I told you were going to miss. How can I develop more comfort with jumps in general? It's the same idea. If my mind knows where I want to go, and I move in such a way that there is no agency with how my hands fly, right? My hands move because I give them a directive. I'm just hearing a certain sound. I just hear those notes, and they will sound. Those will sound, right? It's to trust our hands to find it. So that's something that I ask my students to do. Be able to jump around. It could be single notes. It could be chords. Be able to just move around. Once there's a slight bit of tension within the hand or the arm, it doesn't work. I can't find it, right? But if this is all limp, my fingers will move freely. They can go. They will be there. Once I watch my hands, there's again that sense of conscious control of the movement, and I will move in a more cautious way. It won't be as immediate, not as intuitive. It becomes less organic and becomes somewhat robotic. So once you can develop that trust in moving around the instrument, I think it can open up our ears because we're just listening to sounds. So I advise this of any passage, especially one where you have to reorient yourself. There's many jumps, there are many chords moving around. This is another example. Okay, so in Chopin's Fourth Ballade, when I play these chords, I want to be able to send them along their way. And of course, I need to have a mental image of what those chords are that I'm going to play. It needs to be memorized, right? But I find my hands much more successful when I let them fly. So the idea of going back to building that trust within the hands, if my hands are in preparation to play and they are not necessarily in a formation, you're not holding that chord in the palm of your hands. You might just have your hands where they need to be, but the image of that chord is so strong and in your head. And whatever sound that you're looking for, when you need to produce it, whether it is very light, your fingers can find it. Or if it's something that's really powerful, you'll cultivate kinetic chains, ways of using your elbow, your arms, your shoulders, all of that to create the sound that you're looking for. And it doesn't need winding up. It doesn't need excess energy. It's just the thought of that chord with whatever sound you're looking for. You know, the hands can be trusted to find it and to create the kind of sound you're looking for when you need it. Almost, again, the sense of out-of-body experience. There's no agency. Not you telling your hands what to do. So to work in this kind of a manner, if you do so a little bit every day, learning to play arpeggios, for instance, without looking. So you're not trying to control where that thumb goes, but can we trust our hands to fly down this path if we enable them to feel trusted? And, you know, of course, the famous saying, you dance like nobody's watching. Right? Sing like nobody's listening. You know, it's the same thing. Play like nobody's judging. If one can do so, we develop that ease that we're always looking for, right? A certain effortless mastery. Not to be confused with making it too easy and be detached, right? The idea is you can be even more engaged with your narrative, with the emotional content of a passage, with the composer's intentions. You can become even more engaged if we're not as fixated on how we're doing it. So I do want to put out one disclaimer. None of what I'm talking about should be a means to shortcutting your way there. We cannot discount thoughtful, conscious practicing, very goal-oriented. because without that, we wouldn't be able to develop the tools necessary at our disposals to just trust our hands. Like, there's no way I could just suddenly pick up a guitar and apply any of these methods whatsoever. I'd be much too judgmental of what's happening and unaware and uncertain. So put in the work, put in the repetitions. But there comes a time when we should learn to trust our hands and not be judgmental. Trust our work. Trust our intuition and even our instincts, which can be built up and developed over time if we've had enough of these positive experiences so that we're going on stage without this feeling of fight or flight. But let's just enjoy sounds. Let's just enjoy the music. Let's communicate our intentions. If we can take ourselves to that very place on stage, I think that is the true definition of freedom at the piano, right? When we transcend our physical selves. So thank you for listening, and enjoy your music making. And it was a pleasure to speak with you. And I do want to say one last thing. We'll end on this note. I think as pianists, if the majority of our work, or if all of our work exclusively is centered around works in progress, in preparation for a concert, or jury exams, auditions, whatnot, there's a lot of negativity there because there's a lot of this feeling within us that things are not ready, that we still have so much further to go, that we don't measure up to our past, to our potential, to outside competitors. And of course, it's a cliche to think it's more about the process than it is about the material rewards. But sometimes there are real stakes, right? It's your future, being able to get into a certain school, or having a successful job interview, performance, or whatnot. So there are real stakes. I think it's so important as musicians that we have enough experiences that counter that. So to sight read, to improvise, to play old pieces, play music where there is not that voice of judgment, where it's just music for music's sake, where we allow ourselves to have a deeper listening experience and we can feel like we're at one with the music, at one with ourselves, where we can regulate our breathing, where we can listen to our sound, we can be more conscious of our posture and sound production. It's hard to put ourselves in those places when the piece is brand new, because everything is too self-conscious, right? It's still being worked through. So when you play these older pieces and then you switch back and forth, new piece, older piece, new piece, older piece, something about the older piece will gain a certain spontaneity, a freshness, and the new piece will just suddenly feel more mature. Something about our physicality from the older piece will come into the new piece, even if it's a completely different style. Our performance energy that we've worked so hard to cultivate through all of those experiences, our subconscious can be trusted to take that and bring it into the new piece that we're playing. So I always like to swing back and forth, this pendulum-like swinging between conscious versus subconscious, old and new. Being very much aware, listening to every little detail, to zooming out and taking in the whole picture. Focusing on the fingers versus feeling the entire room where you are and the air that you breathe and the ground, the floor underneath you, how high is that ceiling and the walls. So to really get a sense of your space and your sound as it fills up that space. To really go back and forth, touching all of these different realms, and to swing, so it naturally swings one way and it swings right back. If we find that within our work, I think that's the best way to fight the negative internal voices within. We hear something negative within ourselves, swing it back the other direction. If somebody tells you something negatively out there, swing it back and reflect on a positive experience you had. Find something positive from within you that gives you that soothing quality that music might give to the average listener. Right? That's what we want to tap into. So thank you for joining me. It was a pleasure to speak about this topic today.